Medical workers of Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? A teenage girl who was having an asthma attack while she was at someone's house she wasn't supposed to be at. My mom's gonna kill me, she died at the hospital. The reason why I always take my inhaler. I'm an emergency nurse, and there's one thing that always gets me when patients die. Not what they say, but what their husband, wife, parents say when they've gone. I've had it a few times, but the most memorable was a man in his 70s whose wife had just passed away, and he was holding her hand and crying, and he just looked up at me and said, "I've loved her for 55 years, she's my whole life. What do I do without her? It breaks me every time." IQ nurse here. I relate to this so much. Had a patient in her 30s who was dying after being hit by a drunk driver. Her husband was at the bedside repeating, "What do I do? What do I do?" while crying. They had already lost their baby girl in the accident. Every healthcare worker who entered that room was deeply affected by that. It was awful. My husband is a PICU nurse, and one morning he came home in a bit of a daze. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me about a little boy who had been in PICU for a few days already and wasn't getting better. Most nights, the little boy would wake up, so one of the nurses would keep him company while he fell asleep again. My husband was doing just that. He read him a book, then just sat there with the boy listening to music so he would go back to sleep. Before falling asleep, the little boy said, "You were my favorite." The boy passed away in the morning. His little heart gave out and refused to restart. Although all patients are important, some leave more of an impression than others. Until that point, that little boy hadn't stood out to my husband, and he felt terrible about it because, clearly, he had made a big impression on that little boy. That was the only patient's funeral he has ever attended. Nurse, in hospital caring for 40-ish man with brain tumor, coming in and out of consciousness. Not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying non-stop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice, response to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do. So I asked his wife to do the loud voice part, so the voice he would hear would be hers, not mine, and she did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization was that this by now profoundly unconscious patient took her hand to his lips and kissed it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I am haunted, but not in a bad way. My grandpa was similar, struggling to hang on but not responsive. My grandma grabbed his hand and said, "It's okay, you can go, the kids will take care of me." He was gone within the hour. He loved her so much that it wasn't a surprise that he needed her permission to die. Sweet guy in his 20s with endocarditis, heart valve infection, caused by IV drug abuse. I was prepping him for his third open heart surgery when he sat up, looked me in the eye, and said, "I'm going to die, aren't I?" He did not survive the surgery. Damn, this one hit me hard. When I was a senior resident, a young man, late 20s, was admitted for pneumonia. He got worse quickly and I was called to his room to help while on call that night. He was having trouble breathing and needed intubated. I explained all this to him and that I would sedate him and then get him intubated so we could help him breathe. He agreed and we got everything ready. The last thing he said to me was, "Doc, please don't let me die." I told him I would do my very best. I got him intubated and transferred to the ICU. A few weeks later I was on call covering the ICU and he was barely hanging on. I knew he would not make it through the night. He went into VFib several times and I was able to bring him back, but only briefly. He was just too sick and he died shortly after that. It was horrible talking to his mother and girlfriend and comforting them, knowing the last words he ever spoke were to me saying, "Please don't let me die." On the other hand, you were true to your word. You did your best and didn't let him die. Death had to fight you for it. I've been a medic for 20 years. I have helped countless patients survive, and far too many that didn't, to the point of questioning my own sanity. Your single comment has just made one of the most profound changes in my own life. This is absolutely the best way I've ever heard it described. I used to feel like I was a failure or didn't do enough if the PT didn't pull through. Now, I see it was a knockdown drag-out battle for their life. In medic training, They said there were 3 kinds of patients: those who will die no matter what, those who will live no matter what, and those who need your help to live. I found it somewhat comforting to be so bluntly told that some will die even if you do absolutely everything you can. Sadly, we cannot save everyone. It wasn't words, but the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR, through her and her family's wishes. She was losing her battle, and her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and half sitting up in bed, and a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay. You're not alone. We're right here with you. It's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. My mom passed away a couple of hours after I told her I'd be okay and that it's okay for her to go. I've always hoped that I was able to give her the peace of mind she needed to let go. Nursing home. Most elderly people are at ease as they get nearer and nearer to death. But this old lady, as she deteriorated over her last week or so, would scream, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die." Really heartbreaking to see. With wide eyes, "Don't listen to my family. They want to keep Ma around forever but I just want to die. They won't let me." Edit. She wanted to get off dialysis, which was a death sentence for her. My mom and I cared for my grandmother in her final months. We were at her house pretty much every day, cleaning her up, feeding her, helping her to the restroom, and keeping her company. My grandfather was and is still alive, but he's a shit. We had already done our crying and mourning, and were ready to let her go when the time came. When she was clinging to life in the hospital, my aunt and uncles came out of the woodworks. The doctor asked if they should resuscitate and they all emphatically said yes, to do whatever it takes to keep her alive. Basically they were guilty about not having come around until her final moments, and wanted to drag out her misery to make themselves feel better. My mom and I put our foot down. That's not what grandma wanted, and it sure as hell wasn't what she deserved. It was a fight but we won in the end and she was able to go without a fight on her end when it was time. People can be real selfish assholes. I was visiting my grandpa and had to leave town and go back to medical school, and I told him I loved him and would see him later. He told me he loved me too, but no I won't. He was right. He died a week later of pneumonia. Not the very last words, but I had a patient in her early 20s who was severely thrombocytopenic and bleeding profusely for days ask me if she was going to make it. I had to look her in the eyes and tell her there is a good chance she wouldn't. I thought she would bust into tears but no, she just kind of sat back and accepted it. I think she already knew. She died shortly after I got off shift. Hospice nurse here had a patient who was experiencing terminal agitation. With an expression of complete terror on his face he said, "Help me. They are coming to get me. Can I smoke in here?" We were on an ambulance. I'm an intern at a home for patients with Alzheimer and have only been there for a few weeks. The first patient to pass during my internship said, "Who am I?" For some reason it saddens me deeply and I can't seem to let it go. I'm an EMT. Had a patient say, "I don't feel so good," right before they dropped dead of massive heart attack. It was just the matter of fact way they said it. My goddamn twat is cold tough 86-year-old bird with orange hair, white roots and tattoos. Last word spoken while having groin prepped with cold soap for cardiac catheterization. RN here. I don't remember this guy's admitting diagnosis. He wasn't assigned to me, but my coworker asked me to help start an IV on him. He needed a unit of blood and his peripheral access had gone bad. I placed a tourniquet and was ready to stick. Then he looked at me and said, "I'm dying." Immediately went unresponsive. I checked his pupils. I watched one dilate and damp, the other constrict. We coded him. Never got him back. Not a medic. My friend's brother committed suicide. He hung himself in his closet while she watched TV in the living room. The last thing he said before going upstairs was, "I'm going to rest." That weirded her out because he never spoke like that. Not haunting but it went. So this is what retirement is like. He got hit by a car within a few days of retirement and it has to be the funniest last words. Normally they are sad last words. not a medical worker, but when I was 14 my friends and I were joking around before our 7th period theater class. My one friend, who was always a big goof, was playing along with a joke that he and another classmate were breaking up and said, "This relationship is over," then spun around and fell to the floor for dramatic effect. Except it wasn't for dramatic effect, because he actually suffered heart failure and died instantly from an unknown condition, acute myocarditis. None of us realized it and laughed along. I even picked up his glasses from the floor and put them on to tease him about how blind he was. When I tried to give him his glasses back I was struck by how discolored his face was, and then blood began to pour from his mouth. That's when the screaming started. Absolutely fucked me as a 14-year-old to realize we could all just drop dead at any moment. My mate knows a guy who was out drinking with his mates. He stood up, downed his drink, said "see you later, boys," and fell backwards, dead before he hit the floor.